From the outside, it barely looks like a building at all. At its narrowest point, it's less than 2 feet wide, thinner than most hallways, thinner than some door frames, and yet somehow 4 separate homes fit inside it. Most people who pass buildings like this in Tokyo assume they're looking at something abandoned, a storage unit maybe, a gap between 2 real buildings that someone bricked over by accident. They're not. People live here, on purpose. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand why some of the smallest legal homes on Earth keep finding eager tenants in Japan, and why, very recently, the government quietly stopped protecting how small a home is even allowed to be. Let's start with the number that sounds almost impossible the first time you hear it. The average apartment in Tokyo measures around 66 square meters. Once you subtract hallways, storage, and structural space, the actual usable living area shrinks to somewhere around 41 square meters. That's already smaller than most Western studio apartments. But that number is just the average. It's not even close to the smallest. Somewhere in Tokyo right now, a company is renting out studio apartments measuring just 9 square meters. That's roughly the size of a single-car parking space, reimagined as an entire home. And in one particular building in the Nerima area of Tokyo, some units are reported to measure as little as 1.8 square meters at their narrowest point. To put that another way, an apartment smaller than some walk-in closets, functioning as someone's actual home. So, how does a country end up here? And more importantly, why do people choose it? To understand that, you have to go back much further than a single tiny apartment building.
In 1947, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Japan established a new system for how household property could be owned, dividing ownership rights largely around income. It sounds like a dry, bureaucratic detail, but researchers studying Japan's housing market have pointed to something interesting buried inside it. For a long time, financial institutions were far more hesitant to offer housing loans to single-person households than to married couples. In other words, if you wanted a stable path toward owning a home in post-war Japan, marriage quietly became part of that path. That single policy decision, made nearly 80 years ago, still echoes through the shape of Japanese housing today, influencing how single people, especially in cities, have historically approached the question of where and how to live. Fast forward a few decades, and a second force enters the story: land itself. Tokyo is one of the most valuable, densely packed pieces of real estate on the planet, and when land is that expensive, every square meter of a building has to justify its existence financially. By the 1990s, as Japan's urban population surged and demand for housing in major cities intensified, a new category of apartment began appearing across Tokyo: the micro-apartment. In Japanese, it's sometimes called kyosho jutak, ultra-compact housing. At first, these units were seen as a niche curiosity, a creative workaround for extreme circumstances. But developers quickly noticed something else. If you could design one large plot of land to hold twice as many small units instead of half as many large ones, you could roughly double your rental income from the exact same parcel of land. Suddenly, tiny wasn't just clever, it was profitable.
And once something becomes profitable at scale, it tends to multiply. By the early 2010s, the trend had pushed into stranger territory. So-called coffin apartments began appearing in dense neighborhoods like Shibuya. Stacked, windowless units, some barely taller than the person sleeping inside them, renting for around 55,000 yen a month. To many observers outside Japan, this looked less like clever design and more like desperation dressed up as innovation. But the story doesn't end there, because at the same time, a very different, much more carefully engineered version of tiny living was quietly taking shape. Some developers began treating 9 square meters not as a limitation to survive, but as a genuine design challenge to solve. Vertical, lofted sleeping areas positioned above the living space, fold-away furniture that could transform a single room into a bedroom, a workspace, or a dining area within seconds, storage built directly into walls, stairs, and ceiling space that would otherwise go completely unused. One well-known series of these micro-studios has expanded to more than 70 buildings across Tokyo, specifically marketed to young, budget-conscious professionals who value location and savings over square footage. And it's worth pausing here, because the appeal isn't purely financial. Multiple residents living in apartments this small describe the decision as intentional, not desperate, a trade-off they'd happily make again: less space in exchange for living exactly where they want to be for a fraction of the cost of a larger apartment nearby.
Today, more than 1 in 10 Tokyo residents in their 20s are estimated to already live in flats smaller than 10 square meters. That's not a fringe statistic anymore.
That's a meaningful slice of an entire generation, quietly redefining what a home is allowed to look like. Which brings us to the most recent, and perhaps most consequential chapter of the story. For 50 years, Japan maintained an official minimum living space standard, a government benchmark meant to ensure that housing, even the smallest housing, met a baseline level of livability. In March of 2026, that standard was quietly removed from the country's national housing policy roadmap. The timing wasn't random. It happened alongside a historic surge in Tokyo rents, a surge dramatically outpacing income growth across the city. For some young residents, and for many foreign renters already facing additional barriers to finding housing, standard-sized apartments were becoming simply unaffordable. Removing the minimum living space standard didn't create tiny apartments. Those already existed. What it did was remove one of the last formal boundaries around exactly how small a legally recognized home in Japan is allowed to be. To some, this looks like simple realism, an acknowledgement that in a market this expensive, flexible minimums create more housing options, not fewer. To others, including housing researchers and long-term residents who've watched this story unfold for decades, it looks like something more concerning, a quiet retreat from the idea that housing, no matter how small, should still guarantee a certain baseline of dignity. Both of those perspectives are worth sitting with, because this isn't really a story about apartments anymore. It's a story about what a country is willing to compromise on when land is scarce, rents are rising, and millions of people still need somewhere to call home.
So, the next time you see a photo of a Tokyo apartment building thinner than a hallway, resist the urge to see it as simply quirky or simply sad. It's both of those things, sometimes at once. A remarkable feat of design ingenuity, built directly on top of a very real, very human housing pressure that shows no sign of easing. Somewhere inside a building less than 2 feet wide, someone is coming home right now, folding a bed down from the wall, making dinner in a kitchen the size of a closet, and by almost every measure that matters to them, genuinely, comfortably, home.